The salt spray kissed my face, a cold, damp caress that did little to stir the inertia clinging to me like barnacles to a derelict hull. Below, the rhythmic sigh of the ocean against the rocks of the coastal cave, tide coming in, was a lullaby of surrender. I watched the water gnaw at the ancient stone, each ebb and flow a testament to time's indifferent erosion. My own erosion felt just as inevitable, a slow crumbling from the inside out. Years had passed since the badge had been ripped from my belt, years spent adrift in the mundane, a ghost haunting the periphery of a life I no longer recognized. The wind whipped strands of my hair across my eyes, and I brushed them away with a hand that still remembered the weight of a service weapon, the crisp feel of a case file. Now, my hands were more accustomed to the rough burlap of a sack, the sticky residue of cheap liquor. The city, a sprawling beast of concrete and shadow, had chewed me up and spat me out, leaving me with only the phantom ache of justice unserved. A distant siren wailed, a mournful cry swallowed by the vastness of the sea. It used to be a call to action, a sharp needle pricking my conscience. Now, it was just noise, another thread in the frayed tapestry of urban decay. I'd traded the thrill of the hunt for the dull throb of regret. The killer, the one I'd hunted through the labyrinthine alleys and grimy underbelly of this city, had vanished like smoke, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and a chasm in my own. He was my ghost, my undoing. My phone buzzed, a jarring intrusion into the desolate symphony of the coast. The screen glowed with a name I hadn't seen in years, a name that still carried the stench of betrayal and lost hope, a former colleague. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. What could he possibly want with a washed-up husk like me? But a morbid curiosity. A faint ember of the old fire flickered to life. I tapped the screen. Cole. The voice was rough, strained, like gravel grinding against metal. Speaking, I managed, my voice raspy from disuse. It's happening again, Cole. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. My knuckles tightened on the cold metal of my phone. The heists, the precision, the signatures. My breath hitched. Signatures. He used that word deliberately. He knew. He knew what it meant to me, what it had cost me, where. I demanded, my voice gaining a sharpness that surprised even myself. The old waterfront warehouse, the one that used to belong to Sterling Shipping. Sterling Shipping, the place where it had all begun. "I'm on my way," I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. The inertia was breaking, the barnacles beginning to loosen their grip. A tide of something adrenaline, perhaps, or just the desperate need for a ghost to finally face its maker was rising within me. The drive back into the city was a blur of neon and exhaust fumes. The familiar skyline, once a beacon of order, now seemed a jagged scar against the bruised twilight. Police cruisers, their blue and red lights painting ephemeral streaks across the grimy brickwork, were already swarming the scene. A knot of uniformed officers stood near the main entrance, their faces grim. I parked a block away, the engine of my beat-up sedan falling silent with a sigh. The air here was thick with the metallic tang of brine and something else, something acrid like burnt oil. As I approached the cordon, a familiar figure detached himself from the group, the detective. His face was etched with exhaustion, the same exhaustion I knew intimately. "Cole," he said, his voice low. "I didn't expect I." "He called me," I replied, my gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the controlled chaos. "Said it was happening again." The detective's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I mean, him." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the warehouse entrance. "The Mo," I said, "signatures." He ran a hand over his weary face. "It's unsettling, Cole, the way they bypassed the security, the meticulousness, no forced entry, no alarms tripped, just gone, and what they took, it's not money, not jewels." "What then?" I pressed, my voice a low growl. "Components, specific electronic components, high-grade military spec, enough to build, scrawled on the wall just like before." My gut twisted, a message. I knew that kind of message. It wasn't just graffiti, it was a taunt, a signature carved in defiance. The tide of unease that had begun to rise within me was now a churning tempest. The past, it seemed, had a way of refusing to stay buried, a relentless current pulling me back into the depths. And this time, the undertow felt stronger than ever. The salt spray bit at my exposed skin, a sharp reminder of the unforgiving sea. I stood at the mouth of the coastal cave, tide coming in, the rhythmic hiss and roar of the waves a primal drumbeat against the raw stone. The air tasted of brine and decay, a scent I knew all too well. This wasn't a place for casual strolls. It was a maw, swallowing the land with each advancing surge. My hands, still raw from digging at the stubborn earth yesterday, clenched into fists. The symbol, that crude, angular X etched into the driftwood, barely visible in the fading light. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a whisper from a ghost, a phantom limb of a case I tried to sever. Years had passed, but the memory of those other marks, those other messages, was as vivid as the gulls crying overhead. They'd been a breadcrumb trail, leading me deeper into a darkness I'd barely escaped. Now the trail had reappeared. A colleague, a uniformed officer whose name I'd barely registered in my haze of disillusionment, had found it. He'd called me, his voice laced with that forced politeness reserved for those deemed unreliable. "Cole," he'd said, his tone carefully neutral, "just thought I'd want to see this. It's odd." Odd. That was an understatement. It was a siren song, luring me back to the wreckage of my career. I ducked under a low-hanging rock formation, the stone slick with algae. The cave swallowed the daylight, plunging me into a damp, echoing gloom. The waves, bolder now, lapped at my boots, sending icy tendrils of water up my legs. I pulled out a small, powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a stark swath through the murk. The walls were a tapestry of barnacles and seaweed, glistening with moisture. The scent intensified here, a heavy, metallic tang mingling with the brine. My gaze swept over the cave floor, searching. Not for anything the police might have missed. They were thorough in their way. They looked for the obvious. I looked for the wrongness. The things that didn't belong, there, near the back where the cave narrowed to a choked passage, a disturbance in the sand, not a footprint, not quite. More like the drag marks of something heavy, something being pulled. The marks were parallel, spaced about 3 feet apart, and between them, faint but unmistakable, were impressions that spoke of a struggle or perhaps a deliberate placement. I traced the pattern with my fingertip, the sand gritty beneath my skin. It was too precise for an accident. The heists. The jewelry store downtown, the armored car on the bypass. They'd been too clean, too silent. This cave, this symbol, it wasn't just a copycat. The sheer audacity, the raw nerve to leave a marker in a place like this, so close to the city's edge, yet so secluded. It was him, or someone who knew him intimately. It wasn't natural. I moved closer, my breath catching. It was dried, almost black, but the color was wrong. I resisted the urge to touch it, a primal instinct screaming at me to keep my distance. This was the kind of detail the uniformed officers wouldn't prioritize. They'd note it, of course, but they wouldn't understand its significance. The tide was creeping in faster now, the waves crashing further into the cave, their spray reaching the stained rock. I had to be quick. I moved to the drag marks again, my eyes scanning the immediate vicinity. A glint of metal caught my attention. Wedged between 2 rocks, almost entirely concealed, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was heart-shaped, intricately engraved with a swirling floral pattern. My fingers, steady now, closed around it. It felt strangely warm against my skin. I pried it open. Inside, on one side, was a faded photograph of a young woman, her eyes kind, her smile gentle. On the other, a miniature, almost microscopic, engraving of the same angular X I'd seen on the driftwood. This wasn't just about stolen jewels or a phantom killer. This was personal. The careful hand that had placed the symbol, the deliberate placement of the locket. It was a message directed not just at the authorities, but at me. A challenge. The roar of the incoming tide seemed to grow louder, a hungry beast eager to claim its territory. The water was already beginning to pool around my feet, swirling around the drag marks. Time was running out. I pocketed the locket, the cool metal a solid weight against my thigh. I had my proof. The ghost was stirring. and I, against all rational thought, was walking back into the storm. This wasn't a planned excursion, it was a desperate pursuit. The cryptic note, delivered by a shadow with no face and no name, had pointed me here. It spoke of a cleansing, of rebirth, words that tasted like ash on my tongue, echoing the same twisted philosophy of the ghost. Inside, the darkness clung like damp wool. The ghost's calling card, meticulous, almost ritualistic preparation. A glint of metal caught my eye. Wedged between two barnacle-encrusted rocks was a small, tarnished silver locket. I picked it up, my gloved fingers clumsy. It sprang open with a soft click. Inside, a faded daguerreotype of a woman, her eyes wide and earnest, a faint smile playing on her lips. It was the same woman from the photographs at the museum, the one whose disappearance had been the ghost's first silent scream. This was no random act. This was a message, a taunt. He was showing me he remembered. He was showing me he was still playing. The tide gnawed at the cave's entrance, a hungry beast licking at its prey. I retreated, the locket clutched in my fist, the woman's gaze a silent accusation. The museum, the private gallery, and now this. Each a stepping stone, each a performance. Back in my cramped, perpetually dusty office, the city lights bled through the grimy window panes, painting stripes of neon across the cluttered desk. Empty coffee cups stood sentinel, a testament to the sleepless nights that had become my unwelcome companions. The locket lay open before me, a tangible link to a past I tried to bury. The woman in the picture, Ilara, a dancer, they said, lost like so many others. A sharp rap on my door made me jump, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. It wasn't the furtive knock of a contact, it was firm, authoritative. My gut clenched. They'd found me. A uniformed officer stood in the doorway, his expression a practiced mask of official disapproval. Behind him, a man in a tailored suit, his face etched with impatience, surveyed my domain with thinly veiled disdain. This was the detective, the one they'd assigned to the string of audacious thefts that had been making headlines. He carried an air of importance, the kind that came with a badge and a belief in his own infallibility. "Cole." The detective's voice was a low growl. "We need to talk." I didn't invite them in. My office was my sanctuary, my cage. About what? My voice was rough, unused. The museum, the gallery, and now the incident at the harbor, the stolen blueprints, they're all connected and your name keeps coming up. He stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the papers scattered across my desk, the crime scene photos I'd never managed to discard. "Someone's using the ghost's M.O., and you're the only one who ever got close to him. The ghost, we found this." He produced a small Ziploc bag. Inside, a tarnished silver locket. My breath hitched. Where did I get that? My hands instinctively reached out, then pulled back. Found it at the scene, along with a rather interesting note, addressed to I, apparently. He dropped the bag onto my desk. The locket's contents stared up at me, a silent accusation. "Ilara." "This isn't my case," I stated, my voice flat. "It is now," the detective countered, his gaze sharp. "These aren't just simple thefts, Cole. The blueprints stolen from the harbor are for the new city filtration system. If those fall into the wrong hands..." He let the implication hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just about art or history anymore. This was about power, about control. The stakes had risen, sharp and deadly. The ghost wasn't just playing games, he was building an arsenal. The beam of my flashlight cut a shaky path through the damp air, illuminating the rough-hewn walls of the coastal cave, tide coming in. Salt spray, carried on the restless breath of the ocean, kissed my face, a chilling reminder of the relentless rhythm of the sea. Each wave that whispered against the rocks outside seemed to echo the thrumming in my own chest. He'd shown me the object. Small, intricate, a miniature replica of the ornate gargoyle that once adorned the old city hall, now a pile of rubble thanks to a fire I still saw in my sleep. It was identical to the others, the tiny bronze bird, the carved wooden serpent. Each a testament to a meticulous hand, a collector's obsession. But why these particular trinkets? Why now? The detective hadn't been wrong. There was a pattern, not just in the precision of the heists, but in the targets. The old city hall, the forgotten maritime museum, the abandoned observatory on the bluff. Places of history, of faded glory, of things left behind. The tide was definitely rising. I could hear the water sloshing closer, a low growl beneath the rhythmic sigh of the waves. Time was a luxury I couldn't afford. The detective had given me a key, a small, tarnished silver one, found clutched in the hand of the latest victim, a retired jeweler. He'd sworn it wasn't part of any known heist kit. It felt heavy, substantial, unlike the flimsy imitations I'd seen before. My flashlight beam danced across a small alcove, revealing a collection of discarded fishing nets and rotting rope. Nothing, just the damp, earthy smell of decay, but then a glint of something unnatural, not a rough, sea-worn chest, but something deliberately placed, almost hidden. My breath hitched. I knelt, the rough cave floor pressing against my knees. No lock, but a small, almost invisible seam. My fingers fumbled with it, the dampness making my grip uncertain. The detective had mentioned a collector. This felt like it, a private collection, curated with a dangerous, deliberate hand. With a soft click, the lid sprang open. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, were more of the tiny replicas. A miniature lighthouse, its beam a sliver of polished glass. A carved whalebone scrimshaw depicting a scene I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. Beneath the scrimshaw, a familiar object. A small, tarnished silver locket, its surface etched with a single, stylized raven. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that locket. I'd seen it before, years ago. It belonged to a woman who had vanished. A woman I had promised to find. The detective had said collector. He hadn't said what he collected or who he collected from. A sudden crash of water against the cave entrance made me jump. The tide, the box, the locket, the evidence. I grabbed the locket, shoving it into my pocket. The wooden box lay open, its contents exposed. I couldn't take it all, not with the water rising so fast. I focused on the locket, the tangible link to a past that refused to stay buried. The other replicas, the lighthouse, the scrimshaw, they were still there, waiting. Waiting for what? For me to find them. My flashlight beam flickered, the battery fading. Not yet. The raven locket was a sign, a message from him or from someone who knew him. The detective had been right. There was a pattern, a motive, and it was far more personal than I had imagined. The heists weren't just about acquiring treasures, they were about reclaiming something, or perhaps about a twisted form of remembrance, and that raven locket, it was a ghost from my own personal hell. I scrambled back, the water now lapping at my boots. The cave was shrinking, the sea claiming its territory with a voracious appetite. I had the locket, I had the suspicion, but I was no closer to understanding why. This wasn't about money. This was about history, and about the ghosts that haunt it. The ghosts that haunt me. The sea's damp breath filled the coastal cave, tide coming in, each surge of water a low growl against the barnacle-encrusted rocks. My flashlight beam, a nervous yellow eye, danced across the slick walls, catching the glint of unseen things. I'd followed a hunch, a whisper of a rumor that led me to this waterlogged maw at the edge of the city. It felt too familiar, this scent of decay and brine, a scent that clung to the edges of my memory like a shroud. A shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom, coalescing into a figure. Not just any figure, but the figure. The one I'd seen in my nightmares, the one who'd slipped through my fingers like smoke years ago. The one who'd orchestrated the phantom's dance. He was taller than I remembered, his silhouette sharp against the faint phosphorescence that clung to the cave's mouth. Cole, the voice rasped, a sound like gravel shifting underfoot. It was a voice I'd replayed 1,000 times in the quiet of my own head, searching for a clue, a weakness, anything. My hand tightened on the reassuring heft of the iron bar I'd found near the cave entrance. "You," I managed, the word a dry rasp in my own throat. "You always did have a nose for trouble," he said, a hint of something that might have been amusement in his tone. He took a step closer, and the water lapped around his worn boots. "Or perhaps trouble has a nose for you." I didn't respond, my gaze sweeping the cave, searching for anything out of place, any sign of what he was doing here. The tide was rising faster now, the rhythmic sigh of the ocean turning into a more insistent roar. We were trapped in a manner of speaking. "The heists," I stated, my voice gaining a hard edge. "They're your signature. The same meticulous planning, the same flourish." He inclined his head, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. "Flourish," he echoed. "A kind word, some might call it madness. Some might call it a pattern," I countered, stepping forward, the water swirling around my ankles. "A pattern you've picked up again." He let out a soft, breathy laugh. "Patterns are comforting, aren't they, Cole? They suggest order in the chaos. But sometimes the patterns are just echoes, or perhaps a deliberate misdirection." That last word snagged in my mind. Misdirection. He was playing games, as always, but why here? Why now? "You want me to chase ghosts, but I'm not the same man I was." "No," he agreed, his eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to pierce through me. "You're not. You're heavier, weighed down by all the things you didn't catch, all the people you couldn't save." His words were a precise, surgical strike. He knew. He'd always known where to press. The Phantom's carefully constructed facade, the one that had crumbled under my obsessive gaze, was a mirror to my own unraveling. "What do you want?" I demanded, the question a desperate plea disguised as aggression. He took another step, closing the distance. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The cave seemed to shrink around us, the roar of the tide a deafening crescendo, and then the unexpected, a heavy thud from the cave's entrance. They weren't the police. Their movements were too fluid, too deliberate. They were associates, his associates. My breath hitched. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a trap. The man I'd been facing, the Phantom, smiled. It was a thin, cruel curve of his lips. "You see, Cole," he said, his voice now clear and strong, amplified by the cave's acoustics. "I was outnumbered, and the tide was still coming in. The water was now knee-deep, swirling with a disquieting force." I lunged, not at the Phantom, but towards the cave's narrow passage, hoping to create an opening. The iron bar felt clumsy in my grip. A hand, rough and calloused, shot out, grabbing my arm. Another followed, then another. They were strong, their grip like iron. I struggled, kicking, twisting the water, a heavy, dragging weight. A sharp blow landed on my temple, and the world tilted violently. The only light was the faint, eerie glow from the sea, painting the churning water in shades of bruised purple. My attackers were a faceless, anonymous force, their grunts and curses swallowed by the relentless roar of the ocean. This wasn't just a setback. This was a complete and utter unraveling. The Phantom had played me, and I had walked right into his carefully laid snare. The salt-lace spray stung my face, a harsh baptism as the churning water of the coastal cave, tide coming in, clawed at my legs. The iron bar, slick with brine and something darker, was a dead weight in my hand. My breath rasped, a ragged counterpoint to the ocean's relentless roar. I'd been so sure, so damn sure, that the Phantom in the shadows was the key. The roar of the incoming tide grew louder, a hungry beast at my back. This whole chase, this whole desperate lunge into the unknown had been a distraction. A beautiful, intricate misdirection, but by whom? And for what purpose? Back on the mainland, under the weak glow of a sputtering street lamp, the discarded satchel lay open. Its contents, spilled across the damp asphalt, told a story far more complex than a simple thief's bounty. Not just the usual glittering baubles and crisp bills. Interspersed were meticulously catalogued photographs, not of people but of places, specific, forgotten places. A derelict lighthouse on the northern coast, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. A deserted cannery, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a dead sea. And then, the piece that made my stomach clench, a faded blueprint of the old city archives, a place I knew intimately. My fingers traced the faint lines on the blueprint, the ghost of my own footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls I'd once navigated with such certainty. These weren't random targets. They were markers. Each location held a secret, a buried truth. And the heists, meticulously planned, were not about the immediate gain. They were about access, about retrieving something. It was the killer, or at least the ghost of them, but the Phantom in the cave. That was a new player, a pawn perhaps, or a decoy. I remembered the details of the old case, the ones that had gnawed at me for years. The sheer audacity of the perpetrator, the way they seemed to anticipate every move. The killer wasn't just a monster, they were a collector, a curator of secrets. The photographs in the satchel were a key. Each location depicted had been a site where crucial evidence had been suppressed, where inconvenient truths had been quietly buried. The lighthouse, the site of an offshore smuggling operation that had been swept under the rug. The cannery, a cover for illegal dumping that had poisoned a local fishing village. The archives, the repository of all the official lies. My gaze fell on a small, worn, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of faded maps. Its pages were filled with a spidery, elegant script. It wasn't a confession but a meticulously kept log, dates, locations, and cryptic annotations. And then I saw it, a name scrawled in the margin next to a reference to the archives, Mr. Thorne. The name sent a jolt through me, a sharp, unwelcome familiarity. Thorne, the wealthy industrialist, the philanthropist who had contributed so much to the city's revitalization. He'd been a peripheral figure in my old investigation, a man of influence who had offered condolences, a patron of the arts, a pillar of the community. He'd even been on the periphery of the initial investigation into the cannery's environmental disaster. I flipped back through the journal, my heart thudding a heavy, uneven rhythm against my ribs. Thorne's name appeared again and again, always associated with the suppression of information, with the quiet removal of obstacles. He wasn't just an observer, he was the architect, the one who pulled the strings, ensuring the narrative remained clean, the image pristine. The heists weren't about personal gain. They were about erasing the evidence of Thorne's past misdeeds. He was systematically dismantling the archive of his own crimes, reclaiming the truth that had been inconveniently documented. But why now? Why the sudden, violent resurgence, the phantom in the cave? That was the missing piece. Thorne was too careful, too protected, to operate in such a crude, exposed manner. He employed others, and whoever I'd encountered in the churning water, they were part of Thorne's cleanup crew. They weren't the killer, but they were certainly the muscle. A single, stark sentence, the final pieces are in place. The last loose end will be tied. And then the true horror of it all settled in. The heists weren't just about Thorne's past, they were about his future. And I, Cole, the disgraced detective who had failed to stop him once, was now the last loose end. The threat wasn't just to the city's history, it was to me. The salt spray kissed my face, a cold, damp caress that did little to cool the fire in my gut. The air in the coastal cave, tide coming in, was thick with the brine and the metallic tang of something I couldn't quite place. It clung to the damp rock, a silent promise of what was to come. My flashlight beam, a trembling finger of light, danced across the slick walls, revealing the slow, inexorable crawl of the incoming water. Each surge brought the sea's hungry murmur closer, a relentless countdown. I'd followed the breadcrumbs, the faint trails of carefully orchestrated chaos, all the way to this damp, echoing chamber. The previous heists, each a symphony of precision and audacity, had been Thorne's overture. Now the music was changing, the tempo quickening, and the melody was turning distinctly personal. The whispers I'd overheard at the dock, the hushed, urgent tones of the dockworker with the missing tooth and the shifty eyes had led me here. He'd spoken of a meeting, of Thorne's final preparations, and a location that matched the jagged silhouette of this place against the bruised twilight sky. My boot crunched on a loose shard of shell. The sound, amplified by the cave's acoustics, felt like a gunshot. I froze, straining my ears against the rising hiss of the waves. Nothing, just the sea's constant, unyielding rhythm. Thorne was meticulous, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He wouldn't be caught off guard, not here, not now. But the dockworker's fear had been palpable, a raw, untamed thing that had spoken louder than any coded message. He'd mentioned a name that had sent a jolt through me like a live wire. Sarah. Sarah. My breath hitched. The thought of her, a phantom limb of a life I'd long since buried, clawed at my insides. He was the reason I'd been so damn good, and the reason I'd fallen so hard. Thorn knew that. He knew every chink in my armor, every ghost that haunted my waking hours. My flashlight beam swept across a small, makeshift table near the back of the cave. On the table, an assortment of items lay scattered. A tarnished silver locket, its intricate engraving worn smooth by time. A child's wooden toy horse, its paint chipped and faded. And a folded, yellowed photograph. My heart hammered a frantic, uneven beat against my ribs. I approached the table, my movements slow, deliberate, each step a defiance of the rising tide. The photograph. My hand trembled as I reached for it. It was me, younger, smiling, arms slung around Sarah. Beside us, a little girl, her eyes bright and full of laughter, clutched the very same wooden horse. My daughter, Lily. Thorn hadn't just been clearing his past, he was forging a new future, one that required the absolute obliteration of any lingering ties to the life he'd left behind. And that life included me and the one person I had sworn to protect, even from myself. The dockworker's words echoed in the cavern of my mind. He's making sure no loose ends remain, not a single one. This wasn't about abstract justice or settling old scores. This was about leverage. This was about control. Thorn was going to use Lily. The water was rising, not just in this cave but in my life, threatening to drown me in a sea of regret and a desperate primal fear. I had to get out. I had to find them. My gaze fell on the locket. It was Sarah's. I recognized the delicate filigree, the almost imperceptible scratch near the clasp from when she dropped it at the park, Lily chasing a runaway balloon. This was more than a threat. It was a declaration. Thorn was leaving me a message, a taunt. He knew I'd follow. He wanted me to. He wanted me to come to him to play his game on his terms. I stuffed the photograph and the locket into my jacket pocket, the smooth metal a stark contrast to the rough fabric. The wooden horse I left untouched. A morbid curiosity, a flicker of the investigator I once was, urged me to examine it further. But the gnawing fear for Lily's safety was a far more potent force. The rhythmic roar of the waves crashing against the cave mouth grew louder, more insistent. The water was now lapping at the base of the table. Time was a luxury I no longer possessed. Thorn had just raised the stakes, not just for himself, but for everyone I held dear. He had taken my past and weaponized it against my future. And I, Cole, the disgraced detective who had failed to stop Thorn once, was now facing a far more terrifying prospect. Failing to save the one person who made my fractured existence worth fighting for. I turned, my eyes scanning the receding entrance to the cave, the angry gray sea a churning maw. The air was growing heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Thorn was waiting, and I was walking into his trap. But this time the cost of failure was unimaginable. This time it wasn't just about redemption. It was about survival. Lily's survival. The air in the coastal cave, tide coming in, was thick with the briny breath of the ocean. Each incoming surge whispered promises of oblivion, a relentless rhythm against the slick, barnacle-encrusted rocks. My boots, already soaked, felt like anchors dragging me down. Lily. The thought was a shard of ice in my gut. Thorn wasn't just playing games, he was dangling her life like a lure. Leverage, control. The words echoed in the hollow space where my certainty used to reside. I knelt, my fingers tracing the damp, gritty floor. Worse. He'd studied my past, my failures, and was now using them as a blueprint for his twisted grand design. He knew I'd come. This cave, this very spot, felt like a stage set for my downfall. A flicker of movement at the cave mouth. Not the water, not the wind. My breath hitched, a silent, ragged sound. The stranger emerged, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. He was tall, lean, carrying a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with an unnerving stillness, a predator accustomed to the hunt. He stopped a few yards away, his gaze sweeping the cavern. He didn't seem to see me, or perhaps he chose not to. He placed the bag on the damp sand, unzipping it with deliberate slowness. Inside, I glimpsed a collection of tools, glinting dully in the fading light. Lock picks, a small pry bar, a coil of thin, strong wire. The same kind of specialized equipment that had been documented at the previous sites. Thorn's signature. Cole. The voice was low, a gravelly murmur that carried surprisingly well over the surf. It wasn't Thorn. I knew Thorn's voice, a silken menace. This was different. "Who are you?" The stranger turned, and for the first time I saw his face clearly. It was a face etched with weariness, but his eyes held a sharp, assessing intelligence. He wasn't a thug, not a hired hand. He was something else. "A stakeholder," he replied, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Like you." "Stakeholder in what?" I kept my voice even, betraying none of the confusion swirling inside me. He knew my name. He knew I was here. This wasn't the trap I'd anticipated, but it was a trap nonetheless. "In Thorn's endeavors," the stranger said, gesturing vaguely with his chin towards the bag. "He's rather ambitious, wouldn't you agree?" I took a step closer, the water now swirling around my ankles. "He's using people. He's hurting them. A regrettable side effect of progress." The stranger mused, his gaze drifting back to the cave entrance as if expecting someone. "He promised a certain efficiency, a cleaner approach." Cleaner, the word tasted like ash. "He's replicating the work of a monster." The stranger's eyes flickered back to me, a spark of something I couldn't quite decipher. Annoyance, disappointment. He certainly learned from the best, wouldn't you say? The old case, the one that got away. My jaw tightened. He was playing with me, taunting me, but there was a sliver of something else in his words, a hint of genuine knowledge, not just speculation. "What do you know about that case?" He shrugged, a fluid movement. "Enough to recognize a pattern, enough to know that Thorn's methods are refined. He's improved upon the original design." The tide was creeping higher, the sound of the waves a relentless drumbeat against my nerves. I had to act. I couldn't wait for Thorn. This stranger, whoever he was a piece of the puzzle, a vital one. "Where is Thorn?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "Where is Lily?" The stranger's smile widened, revealing teeth that were perhaps a little too perfect. "Ah, the crucial questions. Thorn is indisposed, and Lily." He paused, letting the anticipation hang in the damp air. "Lily is the final piece, the grand finale." He reached into the canvas bag and pulled out a small, metallic object. It was a key intricately designed, unlike any I'd ever seen. "This opens the vault, the one he's been so carefully constructing, and Lily is the key to ensuring the vault remains secure." My mind raced. A vault, Lily as a key. This was more complex than I'd imagined. "And you," I said, my gaze fixed on the key, "you're here to, what? Witness the spectacle." The stranger chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Something like that, or perhaps I'm here to ensure the performance goes according to script. Thorn can be unpredictable when he's under pressure, and I believe, Cole, that you've just put him under a great deal of pressure." He held out the key, the metal gleaming faintly. "He wants you here, he wants you to see, but he doesn't want you to interfere. This is the trap, Cole, and you've just walked right into it." The water was now lapping at my knees. The stranger was a pawn, or perhaps a player, but Thorn was the puppet master, and he had set the stage for a performance I couldn't afford to miss, even if it meant walking into the heart of his design. The water was now lapping at my knees, a cold, insistent kiss against my skin. The coastal cave, tide coming in, was shrinking, the rough-hewn walls pressing closer, not with a tangible darkness, but with a suffocating certainty that tightened my chest. The stranger, that twitchy, nervous man I'd cornered by the docks, was a pawn, or perhaps a desperate player, but Thorn was the puppet master, and he had set the stage for a performance I couldn't afford to miss, even if it meant my final act. My breath hitched as a sliver of moon, a pale, broken fingernail, pierced the jagged opening above. Thorn. He was real, solid, his silhouette sharp against the scant light. He held something, a glint of metal that caught the moonlight. "I came, Cole." Thorn's voice, surprisingly calm, echoed off the damp stone. It was the voice of a man who knew he held all the cards. "I know my name," I stated, my own voice a gravelly rasp. A foolish observation, perhaps, but my mind, usually a sharp blade, felt dulled by the rising water and the sheer audacity of this confrontation. He chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "I know more than just my name. I know my failures. I know the ghosts that haunt my sleep." He gestured with the object in his hand. It was a lockpick, impossibly intricate, gleaming like a surgeon's scalpel. Just like I appreciate precision. The water surged, swirling around my thighs now, stealing the warmth from my bones. The rhythmic crash of waves against the cave entrance was a relentless drumbeat, marking the dwindling time. Thorn hadn't brought me here for a reunion. There was a narrow ledge to my left, barely visible, and a cluster of barnacle-encrusted rocks at the far end. Justice, he said, the word dripping with irony. The kind the system never delivers, the kind I failed to deliver. He took a step closer, the water parting around his polished shoes. They were expensive, out of place in this primal setting. I thought I was so clever following the breadcrumbs, but I was always one step behind, weren't I? Always looking for the monster, never seeing the architect. My jaw tightened. The architect. He was talking about the string of disappearances, the elaborate traps the victims found meticulously arranged like macabre sculptures. The case that had broken me. Your alibi, you used him to lure me here. Thorn smiled, a thin, predatory line. A necessary component, like a well-placed lever in a complex mechanism. And I am the final piece of the puzzle, the final adjustment. He lunged. Not with a weapon, not yet. With a flurry of movement that was startlingly fast, he shoved me hard against the cave wall. The impact sent a jolt through my already aching ribs. The lockpick, forgotten for a moment, clattered onto the wet rock. I reacted instinctively, my training kicking in despite the water and the growing panic. I twisted, using his momentum against him, but the confined space was a disadvantage. The waves, now chest-high, buffeted us, making every movement a struggle. He was stronger than he looked, his lean frame packed with a wiry strength. He grabbed my arm, his fingers like iron bands, and tried to drag me deeper into the cave, towards the unseen back. The water tugged at us, a relentless third party threatening to pull us both under, a deeper passage, a trap. You can't escape the tide, Cole, he snarled, his breath hot and foul against my ear. Just like you couldn't escape your guilt. I slammed my elbow into his ribs, a desperate, animalistic move. He grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. I wrenched myself free, the cold water swirling around my neck. My hand fumbled along the rough wall, searching for anything. My fingers closed around a loose, jagged shard of rock. Thorn was already recovering, his eyes glinting with a manic fire fixed on me. He lunged again, this time with a purpose, his hand reaching for the lockpick I'd dislodged. He wanted it. He wanted to prove he was the master of every mechanism, every lock, every life. The water rose higher, a suffocating blanket. The sound of the waves outside was a deafening roar. This was it, the architect and the ruin. I gripped the shard of rock, its rough edges biting into my palm, and braced myself. The performance was reaching its crescendo. My fingers closed around a loose, jagged piece of driftwood. It was rough, splintered, a weapon born of desperation. The undertow tugged, a cold, insistent hand trying to drag me down into the black maw of the coastal cave, tide coming in. Above, the muffled shouts of the accomplice echoed, a frantic counterpoint to the roar of the surf. I swung the wood not with skill but with a primal fury, a desperate, last-ditch effort. It connected with a sickening thud against the attacker's skull. He staggered back, a strangled cry escaping his lips, his grip on my arm gone. I scrambled, boots slipping on the slick, algae-covered rock. The water was a living thing, breathing, rising, threatening to swallow me whole. I clawed my way towards the dim light filtering from the cave mouth, the salty spray stinging my eyes, blurring my vision. The accomplice was gone, a phantom dissolving into the spray. Only the groaning attacker remained, a dark shape against the churning gray. He pushed himself up, his movements sluggish, a wounded animal. His face, when he turned it towards me, was a mask of pain and disbelief. I shouldn't have, he rasped, his voice thick with pain. Shouldn't have what? I coughed, the briny air burning my lungs. Stopped I from finishing what I started. He flinched, his gaze dropping to the water lapping at his boots. The tide was relentless, a slow, inexorable march, not for anyone. I took a step closer, the driftwood still clutched in my hand. Then tell me why, tell me who sent you." My voice was a low growl a predator cornered. He looked at me then, his eyes wide, a flicker of something akin to pity in their depths. "You think this is about the old cases, the serial killer, the ghost that had haunted my every waking moment for years, the one I'd failed to bring to justice?" "It is about him," I stated, my voice firm, a desperate attempt to anchor myself in the chaos. "The methods, the precision, it's his signature." He let out a weak, humorless laugh. "Signature, it was a lesson, a blueprint he taught us to be invisible, to be efficient." The words hit me like a physical blow. Taught us. Not he did it, but he taught. The heists, they weren't a revival of the killer's work. They were a twisted homage, a curriculum. "Who are I people?" I demanded, my voice rough. "We were students," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the rising water. "We admired him, his intellect, his control. When I put him away, we felt lost, like the world had lost its greatest artist. So we decided to finish his work, not to emulate, but to improve, to prove we'd learned." My mind raced, piecing together the fragments, the seemingly disparate events that had drawn me into this labyrinth. The anonymous tips, the carefully placed clues, the taunts that had felt so familiar. They weren't from the killer. They were from his disciples, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse, using my own past against me. You lured me here." The question hung in the air, heavy with a sudden horror. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "We wanted you to see, to understand, that he wasn't just a killer, he was a force, and we are his legacy. The accomplice, the one who had escaped, he wasn't a hired thug, he was one of them. And the one I'd fought, this young man bleeding out in the rising tide, he was just as much a pawn as I was." "Where is he?" I asked, my voice tight. "The one who taught you, where is the killer?" He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "He's gone, long gone, he moved on, said the world wasn't ready for his true genius. We just kept his spirit alive in our own way." The tide was now swirling around our waists. The cave was a tomb, the waves a final, crushing embrace. My focus shifted, not to the attacker, but to the rising water, to the precariousness of our situation. "We need to get out of here," I said, the words torn from me by the sheer urgency of the moment. He looked at me, a strange calm settling over his features. "There's no point, is there? Not for me. I've learned what I needed to learn. You've learned too, haven't you?" I stared at him, the truth of his words a bitter pill. I had chased a ghost only to find its echo. The killer was long gone, his true nature a mystery I might never fully unravel. But his disciples, they were real to steal. That's not genius, that's just emptiness. He offered a faint smile, perhaps, but I've learned to let go, haven't I, to see beyond the monster, to see the man. The implication hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. He was talking about me, about my obsession, about the man I had been, consumed by the need for vengeance. And in that moment, as the water rose higher, threatening to pull us both under, I knew he was right. I had chased the killer, but in doing so, I had finally caught myself. The case was resolved, not with an arrest, but with a revelation. The true resolution was internal. The tide was coming in, but for the first time in years, I felt I could breathe.